The ticket was a flimsy rectangle of paper, a thing of ink and pulp that felt impossibly light in his hand. Yet it carried the weight of $50 million. Alex stood before the polished oak door of his own home, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was it, the moment that cleaved his life into a before and an after. Before, he was Alex Miller, architect, a man of modest means and quiet ambition, husband to the beautiful but perpetually dissatisfied Clara. After, he would be the man who could give her the world. He could already picture her face, the initial shock, the disbelief melting into incandescent joy. This ticket wasn't just money, it was a validation. It was the end of the quiet sighs when he talked about his sustainable housing projects instead of lucrative corporate towers. It was the end of the subtle, condescending pats on the back from her father Richard and the outright scorn from her brother Julian. This $50 million slip of paper was a shield, a sword, and a crown all in one. It would finally make him enough in their eyes. He raised his hand to knock, a silly formality for his own home, but he wanted to see the surprise on her face when she opened the door. The sound of voices from within stopped him. Laughter, Clara's, a familiar silver peal, and Julian's, a braying sound that always set Alex's teeth on edge. He smiled. She had company. The surprise would be even bigger. He leaned in slightly, wanting to catch the tail end of the joke before he walked in and changed their lives forever. "I still don't understand what you see in him, Clara." Julian's voice oozed through the solid wood of the door, laced with the casual contempt he reserved especially for Alex. "He's a glorified draftsman. He spends his life drawing little boxes for little people. It's pathetic." Alex's smile froze. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into his veins, chilling the triumphant warmth of moments before. He waited for Clara's defense. He pictured her straightening her back, her voice sharp as she cut Julian down for his arrogance. He waited. The sound that came was not a defense. It was a sigh, a long, weary exhalation, heavy with a kind of resigned martyrdom that he now realized he had heard 1,000 times before. "I know, Julian. It's temporary." Temporary. The word detonated silently behind Alex's eyes. "He's stable," Clara continued, her voice a low murmur, as if sharing a shameful secret. "A good placeholder, and honestly, sometimes his earnestness is just exhausting. He gets so excited about his little blueprints and his community projects. It's almost cute if it wasn't so sad. He tries so hard." A placeholder. The $50 million ticket in Alex's hand suddenly felt like a block of ice, then a burning coal. The joy, the hope, the love that had propelled him home just moments ago, it all curdled into something bitter and unrecognizable. He looked at the door, the barrier between his delusion and his reality. He had been standing on one side, dreaming of a shared future, while on the other, he was being dismissed as a temporary fixture, a piece of furniture to be replaced when something better came along. The laughter inside, which had once sounded like happiness, now sounded like a jeer. They were laughing at him. The man who worked 60-hour weeks, who managed their finances with meticulous care so Clara could enjoy her boutique gym and her quarterly girls' trips. The man who bit his tongue at every family dinner, absorbing their insults like a stone wall. He wasn't a husband to them, he was a punchline. A sad, earnest placeholder. He looked down at the lottery ticket. The numbers, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42, seemed to mock him. He thought this ticket was the key to his future with Clara. He now understood, with a clarity so sharp it felt like a shard of glass in his heart, that it was something else entirely. It was the key to his freedom. Within 3 weeks, the lives of everyone in that house, the people laughing on the other side of that door, would be irrevocably shattered. Not by the money, but by the truth. all because they made the fatal mistake of underestimating the placeholder. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this story. If you're finding yourself hooked already, do me a favor and hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tales of karma and consequence. I love knowing where these stories reach, so drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Alex, a man who was about to learn that the greatest prize he'd won wasn't the $50 million. Alex took a single, silent step back from the door, then another. He moved with the weightless precision of a sleepwalker, the sounds from the house fading into a dull, meaningless hum. The cold night air felt good on his burning skin. He turned and walked away from the warm glow of the windows, away from the life he thought was his, and disappeared into the darkness. The placeholder was leaving his place. The memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced a year prior. A dinner party at his and Clara's apartment, one of their meticulously curated events designed to impress her family. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive wine. Julian, flushed with self-importance, had been holding court. He just closed a deal, a small but flashy commercial lease that his father's firm had essentially handed him. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered on his face, and turned his attention to Alex. "So, Alex," he'd said, his voice loud enough to command the table's attention, "how are what is it you call them? The sustainable habitats for the urban proletariat coming along?" He'd said proletariat as if it were a dirty word. Alex had felt Clara's hand tense on his knee under the table. He'd kept his voice even. "They're coming along well, Julian. We just broke ground on the Arbor Community Project." Julian had snorted. "Right, charity work. Commendable, I suppose. I just don't know how you do it, living on a draftsman's salary. Clara's tastes aren't exactly frugal." He'd winked at his sister, a gesture of conspiratorial superiority. The table had gone quiet. All eyes were on Alex. He'd looked at Clara, pleading with his eyes for her to say something, anything, to defend him, to defend them. She'd offered a tight, brittle smile. "Julian, don't be an ass," she'd said, but her tone was light, chiding a playful puppy, not rebuking a genuine insult. It was a performance of loyalty, not the real thing. The moment had passed, the conversation had moved on, but the sting remained, a tiny, festering wound. Now, walking under the sterile glow of the streetlights, Alex understood that it wasn't a tiny wound. It was a symptom of a terminal disease. He had spent 5 years of his life with this woman, loving her, supporting her, believing in a we that had only ever existed in his own mind. He had mistaken her tolerance for acceptance, her affection for respect. He reached his car and slid inside, the leather cold against his back. He didn't start the engine. He just sat in the dark, the silence a welcome balm. He was an architect. His entire life, his entire way of thinking, was built around the concepts of structure, integrity, and foundation. A building with a flawed foundation, no matter how beautiful its facade, was doomed to collapse. His marriage, he now saw, was a beautiful facade built on quicksand. And Julian's jibe, draftsman's salary, it was the cornerstone of their contempt for him. They saw his steady, respectable income from a prestigious architectural firm as pocket money. They had no concept of his real worth, because his worth wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, methodical, and hidden. Alex pulled out his phone. He bypassed the banking apps and text messages and opened a secure, encrypted application. He entered a complex password. On the screen, a series of graphs and figures bloomed. It was his private investment portfolio, a project he'd started a decade ago with a small inheritance from his grandfather, a quiet, unassuming man who had taught him the value of patience and compound interest. He had nurtured that inheritance with the same meticulous care he applied to his blueprints. He studied markets, analyzed trends, and made shrewd, counterintuitive investments, in emerging technologies and sustainable energy. The very fields men like Julian and his father dismissed as fads. While they were chasing flashy, high-risk real estate bubbles, Alex was building slow, steady, unshakable wealth. The number at the top of the screen read $14,278,951.38. He had more than enough money to quit his job and start his own firm a dozen times over. He had more real, liquid wealth than Julian would likely see in his entire life, outside of his father's trust fund. But he had never told Clara, not because he was hiding it, but because he wanted to succeed on his own terms. He wanted to prove that his work, his passion, had value in and of itself. He wanted her to love Alex the architect, not Alex the secret millionaire. He'd wanted to build a life with her based on shared values, not a shared bank account. What a fool he'd been. Their values were not shared. He valued integrity, passion, and substance. They valued appearances, status, and money, and they didn't even have the sense to recognize it when it was sitting right across the dinner table from them. He looked from the glowing number on his phone to the lottery ticket sitting on the passenger seat. $50 million. It was an obscene amount of money, a comical, life-altering windfall. But in that moment, it wasn't the most important number in his life. The 14 million was. The lottery was luck. The 14 million was confidence. It was proof. It was the foundation he had built for himself, by himself. A plan began to form in his mind, not a hot-headed plan for revenge, but a cold, calculated architectural design, a blueprint for deconstruction. He would not be the weeping, heartbroken husband. He would not be the angry, spurned lover. He would be the architect. He would survey the flawed structure of their lives, identify the load-bearing lies, and then, with surgical precision, he would remove them, and he would watch it all come down. The days that followed were a masterclass in detached observation. Alex moved through his home like a phantom, a polite and pleasant stranger in his own life. He made coffee in the morning. He asked Clara about her day. He listened with a serene, unnerving calm as she recounted her yoga class or lunch with friends. The searing pain of her betrayal had cooled, solidifying into a core of pure, cold resolve. He was no longer a participant in their life. He was an anthropologist studying a doomed civilization. Clara, for her part, was blissfully unaware. She noticed his quietness, but she interpreted it through the lens of her own narrative. "You seem stressed, honey," she said one evening, placing a cool hand on his forehead as he stared at his laptop. "Is it that Arbor community project again? Don't work too hard. It's just a little pro bono thing, isn't it?" The condescension was so ingrained, so automatic, she didn't even hear it herself. "Something like that," Alex replied, his voice a perfect mask of neutrality. On his screen wasn't a blueprint for a community center, but a detailed analysis of her family's primary business, Sterling Holdings. He was tracing the flow of money, the lines of debt, the precarious dependencies. He was learning the architecture of their arrogance. The opportunity for the next escalation came, as it always did, with Julian. He and Clara's parents, Richard and Diana, had invited themselves over for brunch that Sunday. They did this often, descending upon the apartment like a conquering force, expecting to be fed and entertained. Julian was in rare form. He strode into their living room, already talking on his phone, waving a dismissive hand at Alex. No, absolutely not. We're not touching anything with less than a 30% projected margin. This is Sterling Holdings, not a charity." He hung up with a theatrical sigh and flopped onto their sofa, kicking his expensive Italian loafers up onto the coffee table. "Another fire to put out?" Diana asked, dabbing her lips with a napkin, though she hadn't eaten anything. "Just keeping the empire running, Mother," Julian said, shooting a pointed look at Alex. "Some of us have to deal in the real world. In fact, we're about to close on the biggest deal of my career, the Pinnacle Point development. It's going to redefine the city's skyline." He puffed out his chest. "Of course, you wouldn't understand the scale of it, Alex. We're talking about real money, nine-figure construction budgets, not retainer fees for drawing sheds." There it was, the casual, reflexive insult, the need to establish his dominance by diminishing Alex. A month ago, Alex would have felt a surge of anger, a defensive need to explain the complexities and social value of his work. Now he felt nothing but a kind of clinical curiosity. He let the silence hang for a moment, then offered a small, infuriatingly calm smile. "It sounds very impressive, Julian," he said. The lack of a reaction seemed to unnerve Julian more than any argument would have. He'd been expecting Alex to bristle, to get defensive. Alex's placid agreement was like punching a cloud. It threw him off balance. "It is impressive," Julian snapped, a little too loudly. Inside his mind, Alex was running a different set of calculations. Pinnacle Point. He knew the name. He'd seen the preliminary zoning applications. He knew the developer attached to the project, a man with a reputation for cutting corners. He knew the location, a reclaimed industrial waterfront site, a site he had personally reviewed for a different, smaller project 2 years ago and had flagged for potential soil instability. A small, cold smile touched Alex's lips, a fleeting expression that vanished before anyone could register it. Julian saw the smile, though, and misinterpreted it as mockery. "What's so funny, draftsman?" Alex looked up from his plate of untouched eggs Benedict. "Funny? Nothing at all. I'm just thinking about foundations." He took a slow sip of his orange juice. "You can build the most beautiful skyscraper in the world, but if the foundation is compromised, it's all just a monument waiting to fall." Richard, who had been quietly reading the financial section of the newspaper, looked up over his spectacles. "A bit philosophical for a Sunday morning, isn't it, Alex?" "Perhaps," Alex said, his eyes meeting Julian's. "I just find it's always wise to check what you're building on before you start." He was speaking a different language, a language of metaphor and hidden meaning they were too arrogant to decipher. They heard the ramblings of a simple man trying to sound profound. He was giving them a final, unspoken warning. Later that day, after they had left, leaving a trail of crumbs and condescension, Alex went into his home office. He closed the door. He didn't turn on his computer. He made a series of phone calls. The first was to a discreet but ruthless divorce attorney, a name he'd gotten from a colleague who had gone through a contentious split. "I'd like to schedule a consultation. I need to understand my rights and options regarding asset division, specifically in a scenario involving a significant post-separation financial windfall." The second call was to a private investigator, a former forensic accountant. "I need a complete, deep-dive financial profile on a privately held company called Sterling Holdings and a real estate development known as Pinnacle Point. I want to know everything: lenders, contractors, debt covenants, soil reports, everything." The third call was to the State Lottery Commission. "I'm calling to make an appointment to validate a winning ticket. No, I don't want any publicity, none. I need to know the most secure and private way to establish a blind trust to receive the funds." As he spoke, his fingers found a small, cool piece of metal in his pocket, the key to his safe deposit box. He'd placed the physical ticket there the day after he'd walked away from his front door. It wasn't a source of joy anymore. It was a tool. It was leverage. It was the symbolic weight on one side of a scale he was now methodically, patiently, and deliberately tipping in his favor. The final act was set for the grandest stage they could provide, Richard Sterling's 65th birthday party. It was to be a lavish affair held at the family's sprawling estate, a monument of neo-Georgian architecture that screamed old money despite being built less than 20 years ago with very new money. It was the perfect backdrop for the drama to unfold, a physical manifestation of the arrogance and artifice Alex was about to dismantle. In the week leading up to the party, a quiet before the storm descended. Alex played the part of the dutiful husband, helping Clara choose a dress, offering his opinion on jewelry. He was impeccably polite, his calmness a placid lake beneath which powerful currents moved. He felt a strange sense of peace, the peace of an architect who has finalized his blueprints and is now simply waiting for the demolition crew to arrive. The investigators' report had arrived in a thick, encrypted file. It was even worse than Alex had suspected. Sterling Holdings wasn't just leveraged against the Pinnacle Point project, it was propped up by it. Richard had taken on massive debt, using the family company as collateral to fund Julian's vanity project. The developer was indeed on the verge of bankruptcy, and the primary lender was a shadowy offshore entity with a history of hostile takeovers. The soil reports were a catastrophe, recommending deep pile foundations that would double the construction cost, a cost the project's fragile budget could not possibly bear. It was a house of cards, and a strong gust of wind was coming. On the night of the party, Alex stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. He had chosen a simple, elegant dark suit, a stark contrast to the peacocks he knew would be strutting around the Sterling estate. He was not there to compete, he was there to officiate. Clara came up behind him, resplendent in a shimmering silver gown. She wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're so quiet tonight," she murmured into his back. "Is everything okay?" He met her eyes in the reflection. For a fleeting second, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had once believed he would spend his life with. The pain of it was a dull, distant ache, like a phantom limb. "I'm fine, Clara," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Just thinking." "Don't think too much," she said with a light laugh, entirely missing the gravity of the moment. "Just smile and try to look like you're enjoying yourself. My father wants tonight to be perfect." "I'm sure he does," Alex thought. They drove to the estate in a tense silence. As they pulled up the long gravel driveway, the house blazed with light, music spilling out from its open doors. Valets in crisp uniforms scurried to take their car. Inside, the party was in full swing. The air was thick with perfume, champagne, and the loud, braying laughter of the city's elite. Alex felt like he was watching a movie of his own life. He moved through the crowd, a polite smile fixed on his face, shaking hands, accepting greetings from people who saw him as little more than Clara Sterling's quiet, unassuming husband. He was an accessory, and it had never been more apparent. The climax of the evening was Richard's speech. He stood on a makeshift stage in the grand ballroom, flanked by his wife Diana and his son Julian. He was holding a glass of champagne, his face flushed with pride and alcohol. He thanked his guests, his wife, and then his gaze fell on his son. "I couldn't have built what I have without family," Richard boomed, his voice echoing slightly. "And I am so proud to have my son, my right hand, Julian, ready to take the reins and lead Sterling Holdings into the future." The crowd applauded. Julian beamed, looking every bit the Dauphin. Richard then looked towards Clara, who was standing beside Alex. His eyes swept over Alex as if he were a piece of furniture. "And to my beautiful daughter Clara," he said, his voice softening with paternal indulgence, "who has such a big heart." It was the faintest of praise, a dismissal wrapped in the guise of affection. It said, "My son is my successor. My daughter is a lovely ornament who married poorly." The insult was so subtle, so expertly delivered, that only Alex seemed to feel its full impact. He saw Clara's smile tighten at the edges. She knew. But Julian wasn't done. After the cake was cut, he took the stage to propose a toast. He raised his glass high. "A toast!" he shouted, his eyes finding Alex in the crowd. "To family, and to making sure we all rise to the level that the family name requires." The message was brutally clear. You are not one of us. You are dragging her down." The crowd, oblivious, roared its approval and raised their glasses. "To family!" Alex stood motionless. He did not raise his glass. He did not smile. He simply watched them, his gaze cool and analytical. Clara, caught in the moment, looked at him, then at her family, and with a moment of heartbreaking hesitation, she raised her glass. In that small gesture, she made her choice. In the inside pocket of his suit jacket, Alex felt the slight weight of a slim leather folio. It held 3 documents, 3 simple pieces of paper. He touched the smooth leather through the fabric of his suit. It was a grounding gesture. The architect had surveyed the site, he had checked the foundations, and he had the demolition permits in his hand. The party was almost over. The real event was about to begin. The crowd began to thin after midnight, the professional partiers and distant acquaintances making their polite exits. Soon, only the inner circle remained. Richard, flushed and expansive, beckoned Alex and Clara into the library, a room of dark wood, green leather, and the self-satisfied smell of old money. Julian and Diana were already there, swirling brandy in large snifters. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and smugness. "Alex, my boy," Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder with a bonhomie that was entirely false. "Glad you could join us. We wanted to discuss a small family matter, an investment opportunity." Alex stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, a posture of respectful deference that he had perfected over the years. It was a camouflage, and they had always fallen for it. Julian, feeling magnanimous in his role as heir apparent, took the lead. He unrolled a large architectural rendering across the massive mahogany desk. It was a dramatic, glittering tower, the Pinnacle Point project. "As you know, this is the future of Sterling Holdings," Julian began, his voice taking on the tone of a magnate addressing his underlings. "It's a legacy project. We've managed to keep the investment circle very tight, very exclusive. But in the spirit of family," he paused for dramatic effect, "we've decided to let you in on the ground floor, Alex." Clara looked at Alex, her eyes shining. She thought this was an olive branch, a sign of acceptance at last. "Isn't that wonderful, honey?" "A token of our goodwill," Julian continued, unable to resist a final jab. "A chance for you to park your little savings in a real, high-yield investment vehicle and see how the big boys play." Alex let the silence stretch. He looked at the rendering, a fantasy of glass and steel. He looked at Julian's smug face, Richard's indulgent smile, Diana's bored expression, and Clara's hopeful eyes. He had absorbed their condescension for years, swallowing it down like bitter medicine. But now, the cup was full. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the drawing. He spoke, his voice not loud, but so quiet and clear that it cut through the room's thick atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "The ground floor of a building with no foundation is a grave." The statement landed with a dead thud. The air in the room changed instantly. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a confused, offended tension. Richard was the first to recover. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "What in God's name is that supposed to mean? What the hell would you know about a project of this magnitude?" Alex didn't answer him directly. Instead, he reached into his inner pocket and withdrew the slim leather folio. The room fell silent as he placed it on the desk. They were expecting, perhaps, a check, a humble contribution from his little savings. He didn't open it immediately. He let his fingers rest on the soft leather, drawing out the moment. "You see a skyscraper," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I see a geological survey. You see a legacy project. I see a primary contractor, Kestrel Construction, that has filed for Chapter 11 protection twice in the last 5 years, shuffling assets through shell corporations to avoid creditors." Julian's face began to pale. "How do you know that?" Alex continued as if he hadn't heard him. You see an exclusive investment. I see a primary lender, a holding company called Swiss Capital Group, that is currently the subject of a multi-jurisdictional investigation for fraud and money laundering. He finally opened the folio. He slid the first document across the polished mahogany. It was not a check. It was a 30-page geotechnical report. And most importantly, Alex said, tapping a paragraph highlighted in yellow, I see that the land you are planning to build this 9-figure tower on has a high water table and is composed primarily of non-cohesive, saturated silt, a near-perfect recipe for soil liquefaction during even a minor seismic event. He looked up, meeting Richard's stunned gaze. This isn't an investment, Richard. It's a bonfire. And you've tied the entire net worth of Sterling Holdings to it with a debt covenant that gives your lender seizure rights over all company assets in the event of a project default. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You haven't offered me an opportunity. You've invited me to a suicide. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and terrifying. It was the silence of a world cracking apart. Julian stared at the report, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He snatched it up, his hands trembling. Where did you get this? This is proprietary information. You stole this. Alex gave a small, weary shake of his head. It's called due diligence, Julian. It's the work you were supposed to do before you bet your father's entire company on a pretty picture. I'm an architect. We check the details. It's the kind of earnest, exhausting work that people like you find so sad. He turned his head and looked directly at Clara. She flinched as if he had slapped her. The words, her own words, thrown back at her, struck her with physical force. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale as her silver dress. She understood in that horrifying moment that he had heard. He had been outside the door. Richard, older and quicker to grasp the enormity of the situation, ignored Julian's sputtering. He snatched the report from his son's hands, and his eyes, trained by decades of scanning contracts, flew across the executive summary. The color drained from his face. The bravado, the arrogance, the bluster, it all fell away, leaving behind a frightened old man. He's lying, Julian insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. He's trying to sabotage me. He's always been jealous. Alex didn't even grace him with a glance. His attention was focused entirely on Richard. The project is already 3 months behind schedule and 7% over budget, and you haven't even broken ground. Your first major loan payment is due in 60 days. When Kestrel Construction inevitably defaults and the soil report becomes public, your lender won't renegotiate. They will foreclose. They will seize the company. They will seize this house. They will seize everything. The sterling name, which you value so highly, will be synonymous with bankruptcy and failure. Every word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of their world. Clara finally found her voice, a thin, trembling whisper. Alex, what are you doing? I'm giving you the truth you never wanted, he said, his voice softening with a deep, profound sadness. Then the softness vanished, replaced by a final, chilling resolve. It was time for the second act. He reached back into the folio and pulled out another single sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk, placing it right next to the damning geotechnical report. It was a simple brokerage statement. You called me a placeholder, he said, his voice low and steady, directed at Clara but loud enough for them all to hear. You and your family have spent 5 years mocking my little salary, pitying my frugal life, and wondering how I could possibly afford to keep you in the style to which you'd become accustomed. Richard, Julian, and Clara all leaned forward, their eyes drawn to the document. They were expecting a few $1,000s, perhaps. The little savings Julian had mocked. What they saw was a number in the bottom right corner, a number with 8 figures to the left of the decimal point. $14,278,951.38, Alex read aloud, as if for an idiot. That's not from a trust fund, Richard. It's not from a lucky stock tip, Julian. It's from 10 years of disciplined, methodical, quiet work. I have paid for over 70% of our lifestyle, Clara. The car you drive, the clothes you wear, the vacations you take. I paid for it all, while you smiled and nodded as your family called me pathetic. The shock in the room was palpable, a physical force. They were reeling, trying to process two world-shattering revelations at once. Their company was a sham, and the man they despised was secretly, independently, richer than they could have imagined. But Alex wasn't finished. The architect was not just demolishing the old structure, he was unveiling the new one. He reached into his wallet. He slowly, deliberately pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn from being carried for 3 weeks. He unfolded it and placed it on the desk, on top of the other two documents. A lottery ticket. And then, just for a laugh, the universe decided to add this, he said. 3 weeks ago, I won. $50 million. I drove home, my heart pounding. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to tell you, Clara, to tell you that all our worries were over, that we could build anything we wanted, that I could finally give you the world you thought you deserved. He paused, his eyes boring into hers. But I stopped at the door, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a quiet bomb that obliterated everything. Because I heard the truth. I heard Julian call me pathetic, and I heard you agree. I heard my wife, the woman I loved, call me a temporary placeholder. He looked around the room at their shattered faces. The arrogant titan of industry, the smug heir, the society queen, the beautiful princess. All of them, stripped bare by a few sheets of paper and a truth they had tried so hard to ignore. So you see, Alex said, his voice now utterly devoid of emotion, I have a foundation. It's my work, my integrity, my own success. He gestured to the ruins of their lives on the desk. The question is, what's yours built on? For a long moment, the only sound in the library was the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds of a life that no longer existed. The air was thick with the ashes of their arrogance. Julian was the first to break, not with a bang, but with a whimper. He sank into a leather chair, his face buried in his hands, muttering, "No, no, no." Richard Sterling, a man who had commanded boardrooms and cowed competitors for 40 years, looked old. The color had not returned to his face. He looked like a statue carved from ash. He stared at the documents on his desk, the geotechnical report, the brokerage statement, the lottery ticket, as if they were 3 serpents that had slithered into his Eden. Diana, who had built her entire identity on being Mrs. Richard Sterling, began to weep. They were not tears of empathy or remorse, but small, selfish tears of terror. She was crying for the charity balls, the social standing, the admiring glances from other women. She was crying for a life that was already turning to smoke. But Alex's focus was on Clara. She stood frozen, her hand half raised to her mouth, her beautiful face a canvas of shock, guilt, and a dawning, desperate panic. The man she had dismissed, the placeholder she had planned to discard, was not just the anchor she hadn't known she needed, but the ship itself. And she had just helped her family drill holes in the hull. "Alex," she began, her voice a strangled plea, I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it. It was just talk. You know how Julian is. He gets under my skin." It was the weakest of excuses, a child's defense, and it fell flat in the funereal silence of the room. "No, Clara," Alex said, and for the first time, a flicker of the pain he'd suppressed showed in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but a profound, bottomless disappointment. "I don't know that. What I know is what I heard. What I know is that for 5 years, You stood by and smiled while your family dismantled me piece by piece. You never once stood up for me. Not really. Your silence was your answer. I just wasn't listening until now." He turned to leave, the finality of the gesture unmistakable. He had said everything he needed to say. The demolition was complete. Panic seized Clara. She lunged forward, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his suit. "Wait, please! We can fix this!" Her voice rose, becoming shrill. "The money, the lottery, $50 million. We can go away. We can leave them behind and build our own life. Just you and me. Away from all this." It was the worst possible thing she could have said. It proved she still didn't understand. She saw the money as a solution, a way to buy a new life, a new start. She didn't see that the problem wasn't money, it was character. Alex looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up to her face. He gently, but firmly, removed her fingers. His touch was not cruel, but it was devoid of all warmth. It was the touch of a stranger. "There is no we, Clara," he said, his voice soft again, which was somehow more devastating than a shout. "A structure can be repaired, a crack can be filled, but our foundation was never there. You can't build a life on a lie, and I won't live in one anymore." He straightened his suit jacket. He gave one last look around the room, at the family frozen in their tableau of ruin. He looked at Julian, the broken bully, at Richard, the fallen king, at Diana, the weeping statue, and finally at Clara, the hollow princess. "You built your world on a feeling of superiority," he said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You're about to find out what it's worth in the real world." He turned and walked out of the library. He didn't run. He didn't storm out. He simply walked, his footsteps steady and measured on the marble floor of the hallway. He left the door open behind him, a final, symbolic gesture, letting the cold, clear air of reality into their suffocating, artificial world. He left them there, in the ruins of the house they had built. The weeks that followed were a study in consequences. Alex orchestrated his exit with the same precision he had planned his confrontation. He moved out of the apartment that night and into a hotel, leaving behind everything but his personal effects. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright, had filed for divorce the next morning, citing irreconcilable differences. The petition included a generous but firm temporary alimony offer for Clara, enough to cover basic living expenses, but a fraction of the lifestyle she was used to. It was a gesture of decency, not an invitation to reconciliation. The news of the Pinnacle Point Project's implosion broke a week later, just as Alex had predicted. An investigative journalist got a tip about the shady lender and the bankrupt contractor. The story ran on the front page of the city's business journal. Sterling Holdings stock, which was privately held but had publicly traded bonds, plummeted. Creditors panicked. The house of cards collapsed in a spectacular public fashion. Julian, stripped of his father's protection, was named in several lawsuits from furious investors who had been duped by his slick presentations. His face, once smug and ubiquitous in society pages, was now plastered over news reports about corporate malfeasance. The word fraud was used. The SEC was mentioned. His fall was as swift as it was brutal. Richard and Diana's world crumbled more slowly, but just as completely. The company was forced into bankruptcy protection. The estate, leveraged to the hilt, was seized by the bank. Their friends, the ones who had laughed at their jokes and drunk their champagne, vanished overnight, terrified of being associated with their failure. They were forced to sell their art, their cars, and their pride, downsizing to a small, rented condo in a faceless suburban complex. Richard, the Titan, was reduced to a stooped, broken man, spending his days watching business news and muttering about betrayal. Clara's fate was perhaps the most poignant. She was left utterly adrift. Her family, consumed by their own disasters, had nothing to offer her. Her friends, many of whom were more loyal to her status than to her, grew distant. The temporary alimony from Alex forced her into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she used to drive through with the doors locked. For the first time in her life, she had to look for a job. Her art history degree, which had seemed so chic and sophisticated when she didn't need to use it, proved functionally useless in a competitive job market. She faced a string of rejections, her polished resume and lack of practical experience earning polite but firm dismissals. She had to sell her designer handbags, her jewelry, and finally, her car to make rent. The humiliation was a constant, grinding weight. One evening, in a fit of desperation, she called Alex. He didn't answer. She left a long, rambling, tearful voicemail. "Alex, it's me," her voice cracked. "I get it now. I really do. I was so wrong. I was arrogant and stupid, and I was a coward. I lived in a bubble, and I let them poison me. Please, I need to hear your voice. Please, just talk to me." He listened to the message the next morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out the window of his new, minimalist apartment. He felt a pang of pity, but it was the distant pity one feels for a stranger's misfortune. He had Ms. Albright return the call. The message was kind, but firm. All communication was to go through their respective lawyers. The divorce was proceeding. But amidst the wreckage, an unexpected shoot of green emerged. Clara's younger sister, Amelia, had always been the quiet one in the family, an observer on the sidelines. A week after the party, she reached out to Alex. She met him at a coffee shop, looking nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said, twisting a napkin in her hands. "For all of it. For years. I always knew they were wrong about you, Alex. You were the only one who ever asked me about my classes, who remembered the name of my photography professor. You were kind, and I was a coward. I never spoke up." Alex looked at her genuine remorse, and saw something of the integrity he valued. "It's not easy to stand up to them," he said, and it was the first time he had referred to them in the past tense. "I know," she said, "but I should have." She hesitated. "I'm quitting my job at my dad's company. It was just a vanity title anyway. I'm going back to school for graphic design." An idea sparked in Alex's mind. "When you're done," he said, "call me. I'm starting my own firm, and I'm going to need a good designer." Amelia's eyes widened. A small, genuine smile lit up her face. "Really?" "I only hire people based on character," Alex said. "It seems to be a more reliable metric than a family name." He was building something new, and he was choosing his foundation carefully this time. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, and with them, the landscape of their lives. The divorce was finalized. The Sterling scandal became old news. Life moved on. Alex's new firm, which he had named Bedrock Designs, was not just surviving, it was thriving. The name was a quiet, personal statement. He had used a portion of the lottery winnings, not for a private jet or a sprawling mansion, but as seed capital for the firm and to establish a foundation that provided grants for innovative, low-cost urban housing projects. He poured his energy, his brilliance, and his newfound freedom into his work. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming architect. He was a visionary. His designs, which had once been dismissed as little boxes, were now lauded in architectural journals for their elegance, efficiency, and human-centered approach. He won a major contract to design a new community library, beating out several larger, more established firms. He was happy, fulfilled, and at peace. He had lost a wife, but he had found himself. Amelia, true to her word, finished her design course with honors. She was now Bedrock Design's head of branding and marketing. Her eye for clean, honest aesthetics was a perfect match for Alex's architectural philosophy. Their relationship was one of mutual respect and creative synergy. a partnership built on shared values, not romantic entanglement. One afternoon, Alex received an unexpected letter. It was from Clara. The envelope was plain, the address written in an unfamiliar, less flamboyant script. He almost threw it away, but something made him open it. The letter was short. "Alex, I don't expect you to reply to this. I don't deserve a reply. I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the alimony, but for telling me the truth. It was the cruelest and kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. I'm working now, at a coffee shop. It's hard. People are rude. The pay is terrible. And I have never felt more alive. I'm taking night classes at the community college, business administration. I want to understand how the world actually works. I know I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. I live with that every day. I hope one day I can build something real for myself, something I've earned. I wish you all the happiness you deserve. Clara." Alex folded the letter and put it away. He felt no triumph, no desire for her to suffer, only a quiet, melancholy acceptance. She was finally starting her own journey, walking a hard road he knew she had to walk alone. Her apology was not a plea to get him back. It was a statement of her own dawning self-respect. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about being forgiven by others. It was about learning to live with yourself. A final glimpse of the antagonist completed the picture. Julian had avoided jail time, but had been forced to declare personal bankruptcy. He'd been last seen working at a high-end car dealership, using his slick sales patter to sell machines he could no longer afford, his eyes holding the haunted, bitter look of a man who had flown too close to the sun and had his wings of privilege melted away. Richard and Diana lived in their sterile condo. Their world shrunk to the size of a television screen. Richard had aged a decade, his bluster gone, replaced by a roomy, vacant stare. They were ghosts haunting the memory of a life they had not earned and did not know how to live without. They had not been destroyed by Alex, he understood now. He had simply held up a mirror, and they had been destroyed by their own reflection. The city skyline glittered, a tapestry of a million lights against the deep indigo of the evening. Alex stood on the expansive terrace of his penthouse apartment, a space he had designed himself. It wasn't ostentatious. The lines were clean, the materials honest, glass, steel, reclaimed wood. It was a space that valued the view over the furnishings, substance over style. It was a home, not a statement. The soft sound of a sliding door announced Amelia's arrival. She joined him at the railing, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. She was his partner at the firm now, her sharp design sense and marketing savvy having been instrumental in their rapid success. Theirs was a friendship forged in the fires of her family's downfall, a bond of mutual respect that was deeper and more honest than any relationship Alex had known before. "The final renders for the library project came in," she said, her voice calm and professional. "They look incredible. You really outdid yourself." "We outdid ourselves," he corrected her gently. "It was a team effort." They stood in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the city breathe below them. "You know," Amelia said, her gaze distant, "Clara called me last week, just to check in. She sounds different, quieter. She finished her business certificate. She's been promoted to assistant manager at the cafe. She said she's saving up to start her own small catering business." Alex nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He felt a sense of closure, a final, gentle settling of the dust. "I hope she finds her way," he said, and he was surprised by the complete sincerity in his own voice. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a serene, detached sort of goodwill. He wished her well, the way one wishes well for a distant country, a place you have once been but will never visit again. He thought back to the man he was, the man standing outside his own front door with a $50 million ticket in his hand, believing it was the answer to everything. He had been so naive. The money hadn't changed him, it had revealed him. It had acted as a catalyst, a high-pressure stress test that had exposed the true structural integrity of every relationship in his life. It had shattered the weak, false connections and forged the new, strong ones. His true wealth had never been in the secret portfolio or the winning ticket. It was in his skill, his passion, his integrity. It was in the quiet confidence of knowing he could build something of value from nothing. His in-laws had worshipped the appearance of wealth while being completely blind to the real thing. They had mistaken his modesty for weakness, his patience for passivity. The lottery had been a random act of the universe, but the life he had now was a deliberate act of architecture. He had demolished a flawed structure built on lies and had designed a new one on a foundation of truth. He had learned that you cannot build a life on someone else's approval. You have to lay your own foundation, brick by painstaking brick, and build a structure that can withstand the storms. And so Alex built a new life, not on the ashes of his revenge, but on the solid ground of his own worth. His story became a quiet lesson, a reminder that respect can never be demanded or bought, only earned, and that true wealth isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of your character. What do you think? Was Alex right to walk away so completely? Or should he have given Clara a second chance? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Until next time, remember to build your own life on a solid foundation.